hand-dug ponds. This is going to be an in-depth discussion about some of the ponds that have been hand-dug here at EdibleAcres, the reason for doing them, what sort of yields can come from them, and strategies for doing this truly with hand tools. So stick around and watch. When I say hand-dug, I mean hand-dug. There's a ton of videos on YouTube. Somehow, oddly, you search for hand-dug videos, you're going to see examples of people with mini excavators and the like. When I say hand-dug, this is the tool. This is like a $15, $18 shovel. This is the main tool for digging all of the ponds that are here. Every single one. So you can do this as well. It's a ton of labor, but when you're doing it with hand tools, the degree of detail is incredible. And one of the tricks that I would suggest is if you get a shovel, first of all, I like the pointed tip. What I'll often do is take a flat file, like a nice broad flat file, and spend 5 minutes and sharpen the tip, the leading third of my shovel, so it's nice and sharp. That helps cut the soil really nicely. And when I dig these, right now we're in early March. The water table's very high. This is the time of year to not dig ponds, but rather to go through and do the minor detail finishing work. Water releases, micro swales, overflows, renovations, that sort of thing. But most of these ponds are dug actually in the summer months. I use the winter to observe where water wants to be or is in the landscape, where I want it to be in the landscape. And then in the summer, when the water table's lower, I then chase that soil down and build beds while I'm at it. So it's not just digging and throwing the soil, it's saying, well, this water's coming out, or the soil's coming out so that I can have a pond, and every shovelful gets placed meaningfully. So you can see here's a berm right next to the pond, where now the topsoil is probably 3 feet deep instead of 1 foot deep. And I've seeded this out to kale. This was finished in the fall. We've had a brutal couple nights, so they're beat up, but they're there, and they'll fill out and be a really nice carpet. But this is an amazing space to do some well-drained, permanent raised bed gardening. I could imagine some bushes and shrubs on here. Just to the north of this pond is a windrow designed very intentionally so that the sun can skip off the pond and be solar gain for the crops that go there. And then you can see there's a much bigger berm behind it. All of this is from excavating the soil out from here. Let's look at one that has a different yield. I'll put a link here. There's another video where I go much more in depth, and you can see this pond when it's younger. But this pond is dug in part because water wanted to be here, so that allows the rest of the landscape around it to be drier. But also, the soil had the right elements in order for me to use it to build cob structures. So the pond you see in the foreground, most of the subsoil excavated from this was mixed with straw and water and built cob buildings. So check out that other video to see that in more detail. And this pond, over time, has shown where it wants to overflow. And again, I'll link to a video. I talk about the idea of making swales and waterways in conjunction with hugel mounds, or raised lump beds. And so the overflow from this pond actually goes on a very complex and circuitous route, ever so slowly down slope. Further, around, hooks over, starts going that way. And all the while, every bit of soil that comes out, as you can see, has been associated with a raised bed right next to that waterway. So now I've gone from flat, mucky context with very little edge to very wet, shady, well-drained, south exposure, west exposure, east, north-facing exposure, a tremendous amount of context and complexity of edge to work with my gardens, and I get this water body. Now these ponds aren't 100% sealed, and you can say it's a downside. For now, I appreciate that these ponds leak. So they'll be full all winter up until May or June, and they start to slowly leak down. This pond tends to hold water year-round, but it gets awfully lower. Every year, it's an opportunity when the water level is low to scrape more of the muck and deposit, incredibly rich compost, and apply it directly to the beds that are next to it. So the pattern in the landscape is always hand-dug micro pond with tons of raised beds around it, and slowly but surely I shave and shave and shave and harvest from the pond rich organic matter. Someday I could always hold the option of running pigs in it, maybe, or simpler would be bentonite clay, maybe a pond liner, although I really would like to avoid plastic in this landscape as much as possible. But there's the pond creating a cob structure, raised beds, and a continual source of local high organic muck to renovate these beds every year. And this double pond, which I started out with in the video, double because there's another one right next to it, this is one of the highest points in the landscape. And so by having water holding capacity ever increasing in the uppermost parts of the landscape, that's going to bode well for the hydration of the soil downslope. It can also potentially set up gravitational watering feeds from these to destinations down. So we're in the western corner of the property, southwestern corner. It's a northeast facing slope, so it all is downhill from here. So these batteries of water can be lifted and delivered with gravity downslope. So it behooves me to have water holding high in the landscape. And this pond, you can still see because it's very young, has been made with terraces. So you can step down into it, again with the anticipation of scraping the bottoms of this for the next year or two until it finally wants to really seal, and harvesting that for these raised beds. This pond was dug with some friends. I would say it clocked about maybe 40 to 60 hours of labor in total. But you know, you chip away at it as you want. And this is now deep enough and wide enough that when it's warmer, if there's water in here, we can sit in water. That was a goal of mine for the fall. And I look forward to a really hot day in May, enjoying that yield from these ponds. So the other thing I want to bring up as an idea is the line between a pond and a swale, and that I would argue it's a continuum, and it could be a blurry line. So here are what I might describe as swales, but they're actually long, shallow ponds, and what they're doing, I put compost in these. You can see it's very dark and mucky. It almost has algal blooms, and these sorts of shallow, long ponds or swales tend to very much be well drained. And in the summer I can seed the base of these to various crops that require a lot of water. Last summer we had a historic drought, and some of the best yields I got were from these ponds, air quote, that were actually just really seasonally very wet swales with very high nutrient in the bottom. And by running these north-south and them having their own microclimates that they offer to the landscape, all of that helps to interrupt the force of wind that comes through. If you can imagine sun absorbing into these dark water bodies by day and releasing warmth at night, the wind that comes through, there's just more layers of turbulence and interaction with that moisture and warmth. And again, all of the soil that comes out is deposited immediately adjacent to create more edge and context, and also to have the least amount of labor in moving what is very heavy. I would guess in the last 6 years I've moved many millions of pounds of soil. If you're going to do it with hand tools, you kind of have to be efficient about where that soil is going to be delivered. This is an older pond. It's a little bit more haggard looking, but onto this berm have been planted, let's see if we can find them, hazelnuts and swamp oaks. There's some chestnuts on the northern end of this, a Carpathian walnut. So they're nut trees that can really enjoy that lump, loose topsoil and fertility and have access to this water, but not be committed to having their crowns in standing water. We're now about 10 feet lower in elevation in the property. If I move towards the west, you can see this is kind of a resource depot in here, so don't mind the mess. Those were the double ponds, and the pond that developed the soil for the cob structures, just slightly higher in the landscape, with their overflows moving past raised garden beds and long sinuous swales, cutting down and through, draining through this huge pile of fertility, past more hugel mounds, past wads of hay and straw as nutrient filters, and then into, again, this hybrid swale pond treatment. You see the raised bed on the left. On the right is all locust material. We're in the middle of the property, so this acts as a good place in the winter when it's frozen to bring my truck in and deposit structural material and fencing, but the hope is to get all that in position soon enough. There's the wood and the fencing. This little pond here I dug about 5 years ago, and I noticed every year, including last year, our historic drought year, the level of this pond did not go down very much at all. I suspect, uniquely, this hole in the ground has tapped into a spring or a recharge in the landscape. We're a little bit in the fold, in a valley, a gentle valley, so it is a point where water in the soil would be aggregating and flowing along the top of bedrock, and I suspect it's expressing up into this space now. So taking a cue from that observation, I went ahead and said, well, here's this core pond, and let me dig out on level more raised beds and extensions. So trusting that this pond is able to recharge itself, now I have more extended water being expressed further and further out into the landscape. Again with raised beds very close by, made from those. And then an overflow swale that sends that top water into a new watershed, sends it off this direction. Now you might be asking yourself, it seems like such detail and level lines and getting exactly perfectly level accurate measurements and maps and contours and all this kind of stuff in order to do this. But I will tell you, I've never used an A-frame or a laser level. I've never looked at maps. All of this is done based on small iterative digging, then time and observation, and then coming back through and continuing on with the pattern as the pattern develops and reveals itself. So again, the only tool still is the shovel and I guess observation and time. Another micro pond in the midst of a pretty massive and well-matured hugel area. All those little sticks you see sticking out are all hardwood cuttings of elderberry and blackcurrant and honeyberry and the like, really enjoying the loose fungal moist soils that these hugel mounds create, and that pond helps hydrate this whole area. You can see future hugel mounds. I'm okay with waiting 5 years before I can plant into that. Likewise with this one, but as I clean and renovate and excavate ponds, I'm putting that crazy rich soil on top of these, and I can start seeding to annuals within a year or two, probably. Planting trees in about a half decade, but trees take time. That little muck pond in the hugel area overflows through this trench into these little micro ponds. And so it goes. It's basically allowing water to release through the landscape so that the soil overall can remain well drained, but slowing it, spreading it, and sinking it. These ponds act as nice batteries to store that energy, that nutrient, that fertility, all that good stuff, and create microclimates and context for various living beings that would enjoy it. There's many more of these little things throughout the landscape. I don't need to show them all, but you get the basic idea, and I'd encourage you to get out there with a shovel and do a little earth moving and see what happens. Learn from your system and be willing for it to evolve over a decade, or 2 or 3, maybe your whole life. Maybe your kids are going to be following up from there. But you get the idea, and I hope you enjoy playing around with these concepts. Thank you for watching.